Welcome back everyone. Today we're going to be covering my tier list for the new patch 14.23. Now as usual, this will be a general tier list for all elo brackets, but there will be some variables depending on your rank. So if you're playing in an elo, let's say platinum and below, and you're playing champions like Kennen, champions like Cassante, they're probably not going to be A tier for you, as they're quite difficult to play, and the 1v9 potential behind these champions is not quite the same as a champion like Garen or a champion like Dr.Mundo, where not only are they easier to play, but if you can get a hit on them, you can completely take over a game, especially in lower ranks. But if you're playing in an elo, let's say Masters Plus, champions like Irelia, champions like Akali, might be placed a little bit higher if you have really high mastery on them, but I will be going through every champion one by one, explaining my thought process behind each champion, and timestamping it all down below, so if that sounds good to you, then let's get started. Starting off in S tier, now you might be surprised to see a couple of new faces here, even though they didn't get a buff on this patch, and that's just because I believe there's no overpowered top lane champion right now. But I hate making a tier list with an empty S tier, I think it looks pretty ugly, so I put 3 champions that I believe have a slight edge over the rest of the competition. Now starting with Aurora, even though she did get a rework, she's still in a great spot, and I'd say one of, if not the best top lane blind pick on the entire patch. There's no matchup that she's going to be sad in. She can win pretty much any lane, and if she's in a good matchup, completely destroy them. You can take Grasp into melee matchups, you can take Electrocute into range, or if you want to scale a bit better. So just such a strong champion that spikes really hard at one item especially. Now, even though they did rework her, you did lose some movement speed. You pretty much get it from using your W, so as long as you use your W correctly and play off that cooldown in volatile matchups, you're going to be completely fine. And you have 2 disengage spells anyway, including your E, or I guess 3 including your ulti, so really hard to kill this champion, and just such an oppressive lane opponent to play against, so definitely one of the best top laners on the patch. Now as for Fiora, she's a champion with very high 1v9 potential, and she's a relatively strong blind pick. There are not a lot of matchups that are miserable. Yeah, if you verse a Master Plus, a Challenger Kennen or Aurora, you're gonna have a pretty bad time. But in general, I'd say she's a really strong blind pick with very high carry potential, so such a great solo queue champion. Now as for Jax, I'd say he's very versatile at the moment. Back in the day, Jax was more of a 1v9 character, but now he's just very versatile, very solid. You can pick him in any comp, you can pick him as a blind pick, even his hard matchups like Kennen, Gragas, Aurora, you can get by. I'd say the hardest matchup at the moment is Vladimir, but as long as you don't die, you're going to be completely fine, and this champion is always useful regardless of how the drafts go, so even though Freak's not a big fan of him and just nerfing him every patch or two, I think he's still one of the staple best top lane champions on the patch. Moving down to A tier, we'll start with Riven, and I'm not really going to dive too deep into champions that didn't really change that much. She's still really powerful on the patch, strong early game, spikes really hard at 1 items, and she's always going to be within the top 10 unless she gets a big nerf, because she's just such a strong solo queue champion. Now, the reason I've moved Kennen down is because he's just a weaker version of Aurora, in my opinion. Still a great blind pick and really good in certain matchups especially, spikes hard at 1 item, but just not quite the same as Aurora, a little bit less versatile and easier to play against in lane and in a flanking position. Aurora, of course, you have invisibility and multiple gap closes. Kennen, you could just kinda can't play that well without flash, so I'd say he's a tier 2 version of Aurora. But still, the reason he's high A tier, still pretty much unbeatable in lane for the majority of characters if Kennen plays very well, and still really impactful in the early fights and skirmishes as well. Moving on to Yone. Now this is a champion where you need to have really high champ mastery on him to make him work, but if you do and you can get to 1 item unscathed, he's going to be very powerful in that game, especially if you're in a good matchup. Now he does have a lot of hard counter matchups, which is why I wouldn't put him S tier at the moment, but still a great solo queue champion if you have that mastery. Now as for Gwen, she's quite versatile at the moment. You can go a full damage build with either Nashes into Shadow. I've seen Riftmaker into Lichbane, I like that build as well. Or you can just go the full side laning build with Riftmaker, Nash's Death Cap. A lot of options on this champion, and if you can get to level 16, 3 items, probably the best scaling top laner in the entire game, and her lane phase isn't that weak either. You can bully a lot of melee matchups, and even in range matchups with D-Shield second wind, you're just chilling, especially if you take ghosts, you can run them down at times, so just a really solid, powerful top lane champion. Now as for Cassante, I'd say he's still overpowered in laning phase against melee champions, pretty much unbeatable, I'd say in high ranks for a melee character if Cassante's playing very well, but ranged champions beat him up pretty hard. They're not going to get a massive lead against him, as D-Shield second wind, very OP, but ranged champions do very well into him, and he doesn't spike as hard as he used to. He's a lot easier to play against in a team fight, so I wouldn't put him any higher than high A tier, but because he's just so powerful in lane, this is where I'm going to be putting him. Now as for Darius, even though Stridebreaker nerf does hurt him a lot, Triforce Darius is pretty good, and you still can go Stridebreaker into range matchups, and still a really solid champ, great blind pick even against range matchups if you play it well. You're going to find a window to run them down, and still a really good scaling champion at top, so a strong solo queue champion to have in your pool. Now, Warwick is a champion where you pretty much have to be a Warwick one-trick from what I've seen, but nowadays I'd say he's a champion that people could look to add to his champ pool, as he's relatively easy to play, and he's in a good spot at the moment. A really good thing about Warwick that I saw from watching the best Korean Warwick play is not really the lane. When you play against a Warwick, most likely you're annoyed about the barrier, you can't really kill him. Infinite sustain and barrier is the annoying part for the average player playing up against it, but the worst part in my opinion is he can just push waves and run around, so he can rush Stridebreaker in a lot of matchups, especially that early Tiamat, and if anyone is low HP on the map, he just one-shots the wave and boosts around the map. He can attack mid, he can attack your jungler. It's really annoying because it's really hard for you to beat him up 1v1, as he's such a strong champ. Before, I assumed he was a neutralizer, before I reviewed the best Warwick players, but he's a champion where you can just permanently push and roam and be really impactful in the early game. Now, as for Ambessa, so a lot of people are probably curious where I'm going to be putting her, and I'm going to be putting her in mid to high A tier. I think Ambessa is a really strong champion, but her early game is still very weak. Not a lot of people know how to play into her at the moment, but when people figure it out and they start baiting her spells, bait her Q1, sidestep her Q2, and try to get an early advantage against her before she can get level 7 or level 9 with Eclipse, she is going to struggle in a lot of matchups. There are some hard melee counter picks, and even some ranged champions can completely bully you. Champions like Aurora and Jace can even be quite hard for you if they are good at the champions. So because she has so many bad matchups, that's why she's not going to be an S tier champion. But if you win your lane on this champion, I'd say she's pretty busted. You can completely run the game if you are fed on her, but getting fed versus a good player that knows what she's doing is going to be that hard part. Now moving on to Gnar, very stable champion, has no unplayable matchups, so one of the best blind picks on the patch especially, and spikes really hard at Triforce. His first spike is tier 2 boots, level 6, so you can win most of your matchups at that point. Even early on, even though Gnar is quite a weak champion, you can force big mega trades even at level 3, but level 6 is going to be a big spike with your tier 2s, and Triforce, you can completely run the game, and Gnar is one of the strongest side laning champs in the game, as he is a ranged champion that you can't really engage onto. If he's got good mega management, you'll just die, so really hard to play against a good Gnar player if he's got a small lead, or if he's even by the end of the lane. Now, as for Camille, after the nerf a patch or 2 back, she did get hurt a little bit. You can play around it, but regardless of playing around the new W, the missing HP, even the little bit of damage from ulti, it can be quite annoying. So she is just a little bit weaker than she is before, but don't get me wrong, still a really good solo queue champion. For all our Camille mains out there, she's still really strong. Don't give up on her just because of the nerf. She's just a little bit weaker in lane, so it is harder to get to your Triforce unscathed now, but if you can do so, still a really powerful pickup. Now, as for Gragas, he's still one of the best blind picks in the game. I don't think that's ever going to change. Pretty much unkillable in lane if he plays very well, but the carry potential isn't as high as the champions above him, which is why I'm going to be keeping him where he is. The Cosmic Drive Fimbulwinter build, I'd say, is really good on him, as you have a good mixture of damage and tankiness. It's really annoying to play against as well. So he's a really strong pick, but because the carry potential is not going to be as high as a champion like Gwen or a champion like Fiora, I'm not going to be putting him any higher than he is right now. Now, as for Cassiopeia, another variable for her being so high, same with Vladimir, really strong blind picks. You'll probably notice by now, a lot of the champions I have in A to S tier are really good at being blind picked, and Cassiopeia is no exception. She is such a good blind pick, but again, this is a champion where you probably need to be a one trick or a mid laner or have mid lane experience playing top lane, so she's just such a powerful lane bully and does scale very well, especially if you verse a dive comp, she does very well. But if you just pick her every game and you are in a matchup where you can't really get a big lead and you're versus really long range champions like a Hui or a Xerath, it's going to be pretty hard for you to play. But in terms of a top lane champion, I'm going to be putting her A tier because her laning phase is so powerful. Now, as for Vladimir, again, a great blind pick, can win the majority of your matchups and scales very, very hard. That's why he's going to be here. Nothing has really changed for him. And for Malphite, similar reasoning that I always give. Don't blind pick Malphite. Don't pick him if it's a bad Malphite game. Only pick Malphite in a game where they have immobile or full AD comp, and especially if you see your matchup, he's going to be an A tier champion in that regard, but he's still not going to be any higher. Of course, if you verse full AD with a Phelios and, Akshamid or something, it'd probably be S tier, but on average, granted you're picking him in spots where he's good, I'm going to be putting him at A tier, because he's still a full tank champion. You don't really do anything apart from ult people, so you're not going to be as much of a 1v9 threat as the majority of other champions in A tier. Moving down to B tier, now you might be surprised to see Wukong here as the top dog, and I think this champion is really underrated even though he's not that popular. I think he's really strong at the moment, and he's really powerful in lane, and spikes really hard in teamfights as well, so really good pickup for a solo queue champion, especially as a counter pick. Now the reason I won't put him in A tier, even though I think he's quite strong, is you do have some pretty hard matchups if you verse a good Rumble or Gragas, or any AP top. Pretty much any AP champion can be really hard for him to play against, but if you take Grass with D-Shield's second wind, especially if you take the new Grass page, with Domination, with Sudden Impact and Ultimate Hunter, really powerful champion in lane and spikes really hard into the mid game as well. Now as for Udyr, I would say this champion would be A tier in higher ranks, and C tier or below in lower ranks, which is why I've got him in B tier, because he's so powerful in the early game. He can win pretty much any matchup early, and if you're really good at proxying, attacking the jungle, good wave control so you can get an early lead in your lane, this champion can be really impactful in the first 10 to 12 minutes of the game, and if you can exploit the game early, then you can translate that lead into a win. But if you don't get fed early, or if you do get fed early but you're playing in a lower elo bracket and the game goes 30-40 minutes, really hard to completely carry the game, so I'd say he's more of a high elo pick. Now as for Olaf, he's still struggling with the mana nerfs, really annoying, but he's still a good solo queue champion. If you pick him against high CC low damage, you're going to have a lot of success. Now moving on to Irelia, this is a champion where the buff, I'd say a patch or two ago, where you can auto attack the tower and keep up your passive stacks, feels really good on her. I'd say that it'll be a little bit overrated as I was reading it, but playing her, you definitely feel the effects of being able to push in a wave and just hit the tower and keep your stacks up, even when you're going to dive your opponent, just being able to approach and hit the tower once to keep your stacks going and put some threat onto them, make them blow their abilities, feels really nice in the early game. That's not including the extra tower damage as well. Feels very good, and this champion is just a great solo queue pick if you have a lot of mastery onto her. You either need to be a one trick or have one tricked her in the past, I would say, have a lot of champ mastery onto her. But if you've played a decent amount of it and you pick her in a great matchup, maybe you counter pick a Gnar or something like that, you can still make her work for sure. Now as for Zac, the champion, he did get a nerf on this patch. I'd say the nerf isn't the biggest in the world, but I am going to be demoting him to B tier because of the nerf and also because of the way the meta is shaping up. I'd say he's not as good as he was on previous patches, but still a great solo queue tank with a really powerful lane phase, really hard to play against in lane. So a great pickup all around for a tank champion. Now moving on to Teemo, I said it before, it's not going to change even though they nerf jungle Teemo, that doesn't matter. He is pretty much Kennen and Aurora with a not useful ultimate. No one's going to be running into Teemo shrooms in higher ranks. In lower ranks his value will go up, so it'd be A tier and platinum and below, but in higher ranks nobody's just going to run through 5 mushrooms trying to get to Baron or anything like that. So he's pretty much Kennen or Aurora level of laning phase without being able to translate that into the mid game. Now as for Rengar, really powerful in lane, really hard to play against, but again another champion where only one tricks can have success on it, or unless you have really high mastery on him in the past, maybe you're a Rengar jungle player that switched to top, you could definitely make him work. Just make sure you study what the Korean Rengars are doing to make sure your build and runes are on the right track. Now as for Aatrox here, there's a new build that you can use where you can go Spirit of Shojin into Cyclo Sword, and that does feel a little bit better, I'd say, than building nerfed Eclipse every game or building Profane Hydra. I'd say that build is his best build at the moment in the majority of his games, but even so, he's still not as strong as he was on previous patches, so I'm going to be keeping him in middle B tier. Now Renekton, similar reasoning, on this patch you definitely feel the weaker Black Cleaver, the weaker Eclipse, it does hurt him a little bit, but he's still a champion where if you can snowball early, especially if you pick Renekton in the right spots, with a jungle Nidalee, jungle Talia, you can make him work for sure. Now moving on to Rumble, I moved him up a bit on this patch as he did get a buff either this patch or last patch, and he is a champion that's still very powerful in lane, but you need to be able to use that lead very well. So in higher ranks, Master Plus, he would be low A tier I'd say, but in the majority of brackets I'd say B or maybe even C tier in really low brackets because he is so hard to make work. He's a champion where you really need to be driving the game and pushing and moving and trying to be really impactful, fighting every grub, stuff like that. So in terms of a champion where you can just play your lane and play team fights, he's not really going to be that. You really need to be very proactive on him. Now moving on to Volibear, I'd say this champion is in a pretty good spot at the moment. You have a lot of variety with your build. Just don't get baited and build Rod of Ages. Make sure you do your research, see what the best Korean Volibear is doing at the moment. Because I've versed that guy a few times and he really shows me the difference between a Volibear that just does W max with Rod of Ages or a Volibear that maybe goes Q max into certain matchups where I was playing Gnar into him. You went, I think, 3 or 5 points Q. You definitely feel the difference compared to just the Volibear that goes Roa and just maxes W. So Volibear, you can max Q in certain range matchups. You can build Cosmic Drive if you need the extra mobility, Ice Spawn in certain games. So he's a lot of variety in his build, but I still believe he's a champion that has to snowball early, because if you're not fed on him, he is pretty much useless. Next up, we have Tryndamere. Now, Tryndamere's in the same spot as before, the ultimate neutralizer, where you can go Grasp and Ravenous Hydra, and just one-shot waves and start to proxy. So if you get really good at that proxy and attack jungle style, you can definitely make this champion work. Now, as for Mordekaiser, he has received a couple nerfs recently, but still a great solo queue champion, especially in lower brackets, has a lot of value. So definitely a champion that'll be keeping around middle B to high A depending on the rank. Now for Garen, very similar to Mordekaiser, does great in Emerald and below, or below Emerald I should say, but the higher rank you go, the more you're going to struggle, especially if you verse good range top players, but there are high rank Garen players, that doesn't mean you can't make him work, so definitely a strong champion that has a lot of carry potential and still scales very well. Now moving on to Mundo. No change here, especially if you take the cookie tick. If you take Grasp and cookies with Overgrowth, you can get your Warmogs activated at level 9 if you can get it by then, as granted you get enough Grasp stacks. So a champion that can spike relatively early on to the game, but because your laning phase is so weak, I'm not going to be putting him any higher than B tier. Now moving on to Akali, I think this champion is really strong in the right scenarios. So if you have good Akali mastery, especially if you pick her as a counter pick into matchups like Jax or matchups like Gwen, you can get very fed early and you can really translate that lead quite easily into the game, as you can just rock up the fights from a flank position and hard force onto them. Now, as for Galio, I'd say he's mainly a counter pick into strong AP laners, so there are a lot of strong AP lane bodies like a Rumble, or a Kennen, or an Aurora, where Galio actually does quite well into them, especially if they have other magic damage in their comp, so he's mainly here as a counter pick to AP damage, but if you do pick him in the right scenarios, definitely really impactful as a champion. So moving on to Illaoi, this champion I'd say is pretty average at the moment, which is why I've got a middle of B tier, straight in the middle, where she's not that fun to play against, but playing her, if you don't get ahead early, even if you do get ahead, you can't really do much more, apart from create pressure inside. Sometimes you can rock up to a team fight early, around a dragon and get vision down and try to eat people if they walk in, but it's pretty hard to force guaranteed advantages on Illaoi, you need people to come to you. Now as for Set, strong in the lower brackets as he's really good in lane, but I can't put him any higher than B tier, because if you verse a good Kennen, Aurora, Vayne, Quinn, any range top champion in the game, if you verse a good player playing that, it's pretty much unplayable, unless you have jungle gap or something like that, so not a champion that I'll put any higher than B tier, as he's really hard to blind for higher elos. Now, as for Pantheon, I think he's okay as well. He's pretty similar to Set, where if you do verse somebody that makes mistakes, or if you're in a good matchup and you get fed, you can make him work for sure, but he's not a champion that you can just pick every game and have success. You're either going to do really well or be completely useless on him, which is why I've got him in B tier. Now moving on to Kled, he does have some hard matchups for sure. If you verse a good Fiora player, good Jax or Yone can even be a bit tricky, but he's a champion where not a lot of people know how to play against it, so if you could have good Kled mastery, you can definitely make him work. So moving on to Jace here, I'd say Jace is just not doing too well on this patch compared to previous seasons, not so much the patch specifically, but the season as a whole. He's not really in the best spot at the moment. There's no build that feels very good on him. Eclipse is not bad, Ghostblade's not bad, but there's no build that feels amazing on him, and he does have some matchups where if you blind pick him and you get Malphited, it's not going to be a good time, or even if you get camped in a matchup where you're playing quite well, it can be pretty hard to get through your lane unscathed if their jungler is playing better than yours, or even if they're just pressuring top. So I'd say this champion would be staying in B tier, but if you pick him in the right spots, if you pick into like a Jax and you hard win the lane, of course you can make it work. Now, as for Shen, this is still a champion that I'm not going to be putting any higher than B tier, as he's just not what you want from a solo queue pick. He doesn't really have great carry potential, he's not the best blind pick, and if you ulti away even if you're winning lane, and you give the Jax or the Fiora 2 plates, you're going to have a bad time later on in the game. So as a solo queue champion, I'm going to be keeping him in low B tier. Now moving on to Urgot, I think having some variety with Phase Rush and PTA is nice, but he's still not in the best spot at the moment, and he still has a lot of hard matchups. Now for Trundle, I've mainly got him in B tier because he's good in lower ranks, as you can just split push the whole game, and if somebody doesn't answer you one time, and you get a tier 2 or maybe even a tier 3, you can completely take over the game. But this is a champion I'd stay away from if you're playing in ranks above Emerald. Now, moving on to Yorick, I'd say he's in a position similar to Trundle, where you do have some hard matchups. His laning phase is not quite as one-dimensional as a Trundle, there's a bit more skill to it, but he's very similar where if you get behind and you can't create pressure 1v1 inside, you have no value in the game, and because his matchups aren't that good and he's pretty weak 1 to 5, that can happen quite consistently. Now, as for Poppy and Ornn, I'll be categorizing them together as they are good blind picks, they're good tank champions, but they're still tanks in solo queue. It's pretty hard to carry a game on Ornn and Poppy, not saying it's impossible, but the carry potential is a lot lower than the majority of other champions above them, so for that reason I've got them as low B tier champs. Alright, moving down to C tier. So for Nasus, this is also a champion where in lower elo brackets he gets more value, and in higher elo brackets his value goes down a bit. He's just a really hard champion to blind pick at the moment in higher ranks, but again, if you're playing him in Platinum and below, you're probably not going to get punished that hard, and this champion does scale really well into the mid game, so a great pickup for a lower elo player looking to practice side laning. Now, as for Gangplank, still doesn't really have a great build that stands out, and if your name isn't Solar Bucker, probably not a champion you want to be playing that often. Now, for Rise, the reason I've got him in C tier, even though I believe he deserves to be a bit higher, is you can only really pick him as a specific counterpick to champions like Rumble, champions like Kennen, and that is so rare to see, especially in lower brackets, a Rumble blind pick, so I'm going to be keeping him in C tier for that reason. Because not only do you need to have decent mastery to play him, not the hardest champ in the world, but you definitely need to know what you're doing. But the times when you can pick him as so low, it's not worth the time investment to pick him up. Now for Quinn, let's just say Quinn, Vayne and Akshan is the same champion. If you pick him into a melee and mobile champion, and you get a good early lead, you're going to have a great time of course, but it's still a champion where if you die once or twice to a gank, you can find yourself being completely useless, and it's really hard to balance winning your lane hard while surviving a gank. And especially if you're playing in a lower elo bracket, I would put these champions higher, actually in a higher bracket, because if you are picking Quinn in Masters Plus, let's say for example, you're probably a Quinn player or a ranged top player, so if you're picking into maybe a Renekton or a Jax, you can probably play the matchup very well, but if you're playing, let's say in gold, and you E the Jax and start hitting him, and then you walk back up when his E is up, your E is down, he's just going to kill you or chunk you to half, your lane can end very quickly. It's very punishing champions to play, these range AD tops, so I do not recommend them for the average player. Now for Maokai, I'll say he has a good build with the Fimbulwinter at the moment, and the healing tank item for Gold is Cord. He does pretty well into some melee matchups, I suppose, but not a great blind pick. If you verse a good Darius player or an Olaf or something like that, or a Gwen, you're going to get run over, and you're going to give them free scaling as well. And he's of course still a tank and solo queue. Maybe if you duo with your jungler and he's really good, you can just gank top and just point click W, that can be great, but as a solo queue champion, not the best. Now for Kayle, I'm just not a fan of this champion ever since Grubs were introduced to the game. Even though you can take lethal tempo in certain matchups on her, I still think she's so weak in the early game, she's pretty much a detriment to your team, but a champion that does do well in lower brackets because the game will always go to level 16, so you can get some value in the late game, but I do recommend staying away from it. It's not really good for learning in the long run. Now for Nocturne, I'd say the Cookie's nerf on this season still hurts him a lot. No changes in the recent patches, so I'll be keeping him in low C tier. Now for Yasuo, just not really a top laner. You can't really blind pick him if you verse a Renekton, Fiora, Darius, pretty much any melee champion that counterpicks them. You're not going to get much done. You're probably going to get run over in fact, or die to a gank. So a champion that can only really be used as a counterpick, but even then you need to have really high mastery to make him work, so not a great champion to play. Now for Briar, I'd say she's still a cheese champion that can work against players that don't know what you're doing, but not really a good blind pick either, and even if you are in a good matchup and you do get fed, it's pretty hard to snowball that into the mid game. So I'd say as a champion, she can spike hard 1 to 2 items, don't get me wrong, especially if you get fed. So I'm not saying to never play her if you do like playing her, she's just as a champion that I wouldn't recommend for the average player, as she is very, very niche. Alright, moving down to D tier, starting with Singe. He could be higher depending on the elo bracket, so he does better in lower ranks in my opinion, but he's still such a bad blind pick, and even if you're in a matchup that's not that hard, like a Gwen or a Yone, you're still giving them free scaling, and they're still going to be more useful than you later on, so just not a great solo queue champion in general. Now as for Cho'Gath, there's so many bad matchups, I'm not even going to name them. Pretty much every champion B tier and above, I'd say A tier and above actually to be more fair, can just run this guy over 1v1, and even champions that can't really kill him that well early, you can very easily play for a gank. And even if Cho'Gath does get through lane unscathed and he does get to 1 item level 9 without being behind, you're still a full tank champion in solo queue with very low carry potential, so not a champion that I'd recommend for anyone to pick up, but if you love Cho'Gath then don't let me stop you. So for Sion, I'd say very similar, a full tank champion that's very weak early game, so no reasoning for me to put him any higher, and Gnar as well. He's better in the jungle, and top lane he does have a lot of hard matchups as early lane's not as strong anymore after all the nerfs. Yeah, you can cheese people and knock them into tower, but other than that he doesn't really have a lot of options. So for Karma, even though I believe she's a tier, maybe even an S tier blind pick, she's very useless out of lane, especially if you don't get a lead, and even if you do get a lead, it's pretty hard to translate that lead into a win if your team isn't playing very well, so not a great solo queue champion if you want to be the difference maker. Now for Tom, the reason I've got him so low, he did get a pretty big nerf on this patch, and even before this patch you would always see him, I rate him quite lowly as a solo queue champ, as you don't really have a lot of agency or carry potential, you're still a full tank champion, and if your opponent doesn't run into you and die in lane, then it's pretty hard to carry the game, especially after the nerf. Now as for Shyvana, just trash. Alright team, that's it for now. As usual, if you have any questions at all regarding the champions I've got here on this list, or maybe a champion I forgot to add that you're curious about, feel free to let me know down in the comments below, and I'll see you all next time.